So how do you typically tell people, like, how do you interpret odds? So like how would you tell somebody to interpret odds?
I look at a range of points, to be honest with you. Like I'm going into it, I'm looking at what I had in that draw. So our odds aren't predictive. We're not predicting what they will be this year with my current point level. So I'm looking, when I look, my first look at odds, I'm looking at the point level I had in that draw. So if I had 14 last year, if I had 4 last year, I'm looking at that 4-point level. But like I say, my strategy when I'm looking at odds is I'm looking at that point level. I'm also looking at that point level above. And then depending on the various states, I may look at a point level below me just to see, what it's doing.
Wyoming's a great state like that too, with when you have point breaks that you're dealing with, when you can see how many applicants are below you. It's easy to see kind of where you're going to be lying next year, once you do pop up to that point.
I had a guy yesterday ask me this question. He's like, what point level do I look at? And I'm like, well, you should look at max points. You should look at 14, which is what we're going to show, right? And you have to assume that all the unsuccessful applicants at that 14-point level will have rolled in to 2021 with 15 points. So essentially you're looking at that point, you're in the same pool with everybody else that would have rolled over to 1 point higher, right? So I tell them typically, if you're a midpoint level, I say, look at your point level, look at the level below, because essentially everybody will have rolled into this year with 1 additional point.
Yeah, especially in Wyoming where they allow you to just buy a point. You never know, if you're in that mid-tier level, that midpoint tier level, you never know how many people have just been buying points for 5 years. Say you find a hunt you're interested in, you click on it, you can go into that detail page and see a 5-year trend. That's the main view that I use when I'm breaking down, when I'm really critiquing draw odds, is whether, and that's going to show you if that hunt's creeping a little bit, if it's trending, if it's jumping a point a year and that trend has been steady for 5 years, that's where I go to that next point level and try and, make a judgment call on my own, whether it's going to jump another point the next year and base my application off of that. In a way, I'm predicting for myself what's going to happen based off of historic trends.
Typically, I try to tell people, look at your point level, look at 1 point level below, and try to consider what you want to do this year with your hunt. Typically, start with that point level that drew, which you have currently, and then start clicking on those individual hunts and start tearing apart those detailed draw odds page like you're saying. And I think Dave kind of hinted on it, but what we do on those detailed draw odds pages, if the state provides the data, is we break down the number of applicants at each point level. So you can see how many people applied, how many permits were allocated for each point level. And you can see the number of people that you're lumped in with. So if I'm at that point break level, let's say I've got 7 points and that was the 100% level last year, I can look at those detailed draw odds graphs and I can say how many people were at 6 points last year, because that's me, right? So I was at 6 last year. If I roll into this hunt this year with 7, how many people am I potentially competing with for those same permits? So there's almost 2 different odds there, right? There's like the odds that we're showing, and then there's the odds kind of based on that additional information, which is the number of applicants at your same point level.
I kind of focus more, personally I focus more on the actual odds percentage, but I try and get it, I'm like you, I'm looking at that 1 or 2 point level above the break point level, so that if there is points creep, I do, account for it when I'm planning the strategy.
Yeah, so I guess maybe to try to be concise, when people ask you, like Dave, when they ask you, do you predict odds? What do you tell them?
No, that's always obviously the misconception. We get questions on that all the time. The trouble you run into when you start predicting odds, especially in a state like Wyoming, where you don't know how many people have been buying points for the last 10 years and just decide they want to go in and try to draw a tag this year. And that's where getting into the historical data is so important, because you'll get into hunts where, say, you see a perfect example in Arizona, you'll see a hunt where the point break was at 8 points and last year was at 3 points. So it's just like Brandon was saying, some guy got sick of waiting out and he just decided to burn his points out, cash out. So a lot of times you look at a hunt, you're like, man, that thing's so unattainable, but in the realistic odds, you look at it, it's not.
We try and smooth those outliers out. So that's like when you start talking about processing a simulation of the draw, a million times, it pulls those outliers out and smooths that curve a little bit. So the outliers we do try and account for when we do calculate the odds percentages, but I would never feel comfortable predicting anything I mean, just watch a weatherman. He's trying to predict the weather for tomorrow and can't get it right. So.
Yeah, and it's hard to, I mean, it's hard to say what people are going to apply for any given year, and with how many points. I mean, people can jump units. You know, they can apply their points somewhere else. I guess as a user, and then also as, you know, as the research manager here, one, do you think that that's frustrating for a user? Like how, and then two, like what do you tell the user, how to use the odds essentially? Like, cause I could see as a user's perspective, you know, looking at it and being like, man, I really want to think that this is my odds of drawing this permit this year. And then like when I hear people say, yeah, but you can't really predict, you never really know like where people are going to apply. Like for me, I partially feel like a little, I might be like, man, a little frustrated.
If there were a way we could figure out how to predict odds and comfortably produce a data point in that, I mean, we explore it every year. We have different people, different, you know, data scientists, different things like that look at it. So we have really smart mathematicians looking at that aspect, and we haven't found a way to comfortably do it yet. I mean, it's still what I would explain as a best guess. Eventually we'll get there. Eventually we're going to crack it, and they're, you know, down in the
Really,
future.
it's probability, right?
Mm-hmm. And if you get enough historical data, you can start evaluating. You basically analyze the past to predict the future,
Right.
which is what we're trying to explain to users how to do on their own, if you will, because that's what we all do by ourselves. Just intuitively, we look at historical trends, and we're just following that trend. So we do it naturally when we're looking at odds. So I think it's important that we share how we do it personally. I think we can educate users on that until we get to a point that we could possibly have predictive odds.
That's a great point. You can. I mean, we could dang near run predictive odds in a number of states. It'd be pretty easy, but there's always going to be like that built-in margin of error that you can't overcome. You know, to some extent.
Eventually, with enough data, he's right. It's an interesting discussion.
The thing is, though, is like you talk about enough data. Well, take Arizona, for example. In 2014, they completely changed how they allocated permits. Right. So now you have to restart anytime a state restructures. In Mexico last year, they decided to change their rounding rules on how they allocate permits. So now you start over, if you will. You know what I mean? And we didn't know New Mexico until we got a data set. We took a best guess and tried to educate members on what was going to happen in New Mexico. But at the end of the day, until the data came out and how they actually processed their draw, which we found they didn't follow their own rules. So, you know, how do you base a predictive odd with a set of rules that the state's not even following?
An odd is an odd, right? So it's the probability.
We talk about that all the time in the office. Is
something might happen.
You're looking at a snapshot of a data set that happened in one current year, and you're trying to decipher what happened. You're basically telling a story of a past event, if you will. And with the odds that we show, we not only is the data important, but I think the way that we display them, and we've talked about that, is we try and display our odds and display all of the data in the most useful ways so the majority of our users can have the best takeaway from it. They can make the best decision. Yeah. And I think that's as important as the actual odds number itself.
On the baseline, they look at odds just on the main odds index pages. They see odds, and that is what it is. But like say you get into the detail page and you start looking at it, I mean, you can see if a hunt it might jump a point every 2 years, or it's jumping a point every year. Maybe it only did it once in the last 5 years, and it gives you a good inclination of what could happen this year.
It definitely takes more. There's definitely more there than just simply looking at the odd. The odd is a great place to start, and but I think there's more there. There's definitely more at your fingertips that you can exploit to help you make a better decision.
At the end of the day, you're helping somebody apply in a state that they may not know a ton about. At the end of the day, draw odds is a piece of that application process. There's so much more that goes into it. You know, I ask everybody in the office, would you ever do your application solely off draw odds? Doesn't make any sense. You draw in Colorado, you draw an Eastern Plains tag that's
you have nowhere to hunt.
98% private land, could have decent trophy potential. You don't know. Depends on the property. Easy to draw tag. Whereas you get into like the filtering 2.0 aspect of it, you're looking at population data, you're looking at trophy potential. You know, season dates comes into play. You know, going into 2021, that's going to be a discussion all on its own.
Yeah.
on.
Or even into states like Wyoming where you got wilderness. I mean, you look at how many tags, like you look at odds and you're like, man, all these type 9 tags, I can pull these things super easy or some type 1s.
Thoroughfare type 9 every year.
But then you get there and there's a 100-acre square chunk that's legal for you to hunt as a non-resident, and that's it.
You know, odds is very important. It's a key part of your application strategy, but there's so much more to the picture than just draw.
I bet you I have 5 right now, 5 emails at least, in my inbox right now, of people asking me, how do I use draw odds? So like, if you were gonna wrap that up in a package and put a bow on it, what do you say?
Each individual could use it in a different way. Find the hunt that you want and then see if you can draw that permit. And if you can't, find another one and use it in that manner.
Like for me personally, like deer, I've killed a pile of deer. I like to look for.
What did you do on your Arizona coos hunt?
Yeah, okay, perfect example. So like coos deer, I've never hunted coos deer in my life. I wanted to go down to Arizona to see what it's like. Started looking, and first thing I did is I looked at all the units that I could draw on 0 points. Identify those, then I get into filtering, and I can start
draws.
Yeah, and standalone draws. I can see, okay, here's the cut and dry. Here's what I'm looking at, my realistic shots.
See, and that's a perfect example of a new user wants to hunt next year, wants to hunt this species next year, slides that slider to 100% 0 point level. It's going to narrow it down to 7 or 8 units.
Here's what you're looking at.
And at that point, you could jump into filtering.
Break down on your filtering, start figuring out some of your units, and go from there. Yeah, that coos hunt was perfect.
When I think archery mule deer in Colorado, my first go-to is terrain. And from there, I look at each individual unit and what units I can draw. Then you get into like trophy potential, population data, tag allocation, how much competition is going to be there. Right. So
that's another great example of somebody, like from that aspect, you start on the filtering 2.0 side. Here's the units that really appeal to me and look sexy to me. Now let me jump over to my odds and see, are any of these attainable at that point? Or what's attainable and what's close?
Is your objective to kill or have potentially the chance at a trophy animal? If that's the case, you need to hunt in a unit where trophies exist. Yeah. So for that, I think filtering 2.0 is phenomenal. You can drag the trophy filter over. You can look.
And odds are you're not going to do it every year.
Exactly.
If that's your objective.
Yep. If your objective is that you want to go on a hunt that year for any given species, whether you have no points or 5 points or 15 points, at that point, I typically steer people towards standalone draw odds, and I say, pull up standalone draw odds, pick your residency, pick your state, your species, and just simply spend time cruising through those columns for any given, all the weapons. If you hunt archery, muzzleloader rifle, certainly doing so will make open doors for you. But that's where I typically tell people, plug in your point level, which is going to highlight that column all the way down, and start scanning for those hunts that the break level was at your point level, at that point level. And I would say look at that and look at one below, because you got to assume that everybody's kind of rolling into that next year with one additional point. So if you really want to draw a permit, typically I tell people evaluate all the hunts at your point level, but also you really want to look at those hunts one level below.
But I think one of my favorite new tools that we have now in the draw odds is the slider for odds. Like you can get in like for that Arizona coos hunt, I can literally jump on there and slide the minimum odds up to 100%, and I'm just looking at the 5 hunts that are available at 0 points at 100%. I think it gives you just good opportunities to really break things down. Do you want to be the guy that goes on one bomber hunt every 15 years, or do you want to be the guy that hunts every 2 or 3 years? And that's where odds really gives you that power to plan that out.